So Claire, thank you so much for joining us for episode 15 of Safeguarding Days, which is all about trauma-informed practice. Personally, for me, I think this is one of the most important things that schools can do at the moment as we look and start to reflect on the impact that the recent pandemic's had on children and young people. So without me kind of spilling on, I'm going to hand over to you if you can just tell us a little bit about what you've done in your school and what you've told your staff as well about what trauma-informed practice is and some of the psychology that sits behind this new method of working as we move from the approach of what's wrong to what's happened to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Lewis. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit of how I got here. So I've been working with an educational psychologist. So I'm not only the DSL in the school, but I'm also the designated teacher for child looked after. So I've been working really closely with him, and we've been talking about this trauma-informed practice and how we can educate our staff within our schools. So what we wanted to do was to really raise awareness among all staff about the wide impact of trauma. So really, what trauma-informed practice is to prevent the re-traumatisation of children that have suffered more than one ACE in their life. So we completed our training with all of our staff looking at adverse childhood experiences. Every child has now suffered an adverse childhood experience due to COVID. And what we wanted to do was we wanted to know who our children are that have suffered more than one ACE. So we know that a child that has had over 4 ACEs has a high probability of their life opportunities being diminished. So I wanted all of my staff to be aware of the impact of trauma and how we can lead them to positive outcomes and how they are able to regulate their emotions and really build resilience so they believe in themselves. So what are the components then of the trauma-informed care? So it's about creating a safe environment. We all know that for a lot of children, school is a safe environment, but it's also looking at different aspects, how a child may feel safe. And that's maybe listening to music or doing art or someone that likes maths. It's looking and meeting the needs of those children. It's building relationships and connectedness. So it's building that rapport with students, taking the time to build the rapport and allowing them to trust you. A lot of these children don't trust adults, and it's building that relationship with them and supporting and teaching emotional regulation. So a lot of the children don't know how to regulate these emotions, and it's about us guiding them and showing them a way forward of how they can regulate them. And I'm going to go through some strategies later on about that. So adolescence then. So the brain is developing up to the age of 25. We know that adolescence is a really difficult time for children and they act on emotional impulses. So you can see the frontal lobe there. This is where they need the love and care. And a lot of children that have suffered trauma need someone to guide them. That is what we do in a school as teachers, tutors. We support the child and guide them about thinking positively, making positive choices and leading them and helping them to have a better understanding. This is what that child needs. You can see the balance and coordination levels. Children that are suffering trauma taken away from parents struggle with a love-hate relationship, blaming themselves really for what has happened, hating the parent for allowing them to be taken away. They need guidance with the judgment gland, someone to reflect with them on the decisions that they are actually making. They find it hard to communicate, so they don't know how to do this really, so they need guidance in that. Students that have suffered or are suffering trauma, understandably, homework is the last thing on their mind with the worries they have. And what we need to do in schools is we need to adapt our skills to look at other ways to support children. So we're going to move on to attachment secure versus insecure. Early bond is so important to a child to form those early attachment and securities. The child is secure. This child has a solid family unit. They have a mum and dad. They have siblings. They have been guided and they know right from wrong. They understand how to regulate their emotions. So in school, we normally would see this child content, engaged and on task. They have high expectations, believe in themselves and really want to achieve. So if the child does not have that early bond where the parent is absent, not responsive and neglectful, that child becomes insecure. They will avoid communication with peers and adults. They're withdrawn. They can be quite quiet and anxious. They don't want to be seen or even noticed. So not being seen means there will be less trouble involved. This is basically learnt behaviours. You may see children that become ambivalent, they are anxious, not focused in lessons, and may ask a lot of questions. They need reassurance. So in schools, we also see the student that is disorganised. They're angry, they're depressed, they don't follow direction, struggle making relationships with peers and teachers, and they have a short fuse and a low tolerance. So this is something that we really see within schools, and we've got to look at how we support these children within our schools. So relational trauma. So research tells us that relational trauma can manifest in many different types of behaviours. Half of all adults in the UK would have had one ACE and 10% would have had 4. So what you do start to see in students within the school is you may see a student that's overly compliant and they reply with whatever you want. So James was scared to disagree with his stepdad, so he'll always reply with whatever you want. You may see a child that's withdrawn or dissociative behaviours, so they shut themselves in a room or float away. So when you're in the classroom and we're having conversations with them, particularly when it's a difficult conversation, that they just drift away. They don't want to have those conversations with you and become withdrawn. So risk self-stimulating behaviours, so may have sex with multiple people, sometimes older, wanting to feel wanted, having that attention, so they go online and have those risky behaviours. So physical aggressive rage, so being disruptive in the environment, and we see a lot of this within schools. And it's questioning really, why is this child feeling like this? Hypervigilance or controlling behaviours. So you might see a child that flinches, they go into fight or flight mode, looking for risk at all time. And that could be because that child may have been sexually abused, and at night time they know when someone's coming in. They don't feel safe. They're always on high alert, looking for what risk is around that corner. Overfamiliar behaviour and all behaviour of a sexual nature. So you may see children that use inappropriate language, show sexualized behaviours, get physically close to you, actually wanting that touch and that feeling, and moving as close as they can to get that from a stranger. So differences in cognitive skills and emotional regulation. So when children are developing and they've not had an adult to attune to what is happening, they're not born with skills to emotionally regulate and get this from experiences and needing an adult to guide the child. So our children will really lack in these areas that you can see on the mind map. They find it really difficult to empathise. If a child has not been taught these skills, how can we ever expect them to use them? How can we expect them to know how to empathise with somebody if they've never been taught it or been guided through by an adult? So window of tolerance. So if you look at the window of tolerance there, we've got Andy and Billy. So Andy had a really good upbringing, loving parent, has a lot more tolerance when a stressful event or incident happens. Billy, on the right-hand side, you can see, has had a traumatic childhood, high levels of stress. So he has a really small window of tolerance. It doesn't take too much for him to be tipped over the edge really quickly. To keep control, less flexibility when working with stresses. These children operate out of the survival area. They can't plan or use reasoning, higher ordering skills. They're not developed as others in their peer group, and we need to be vigilant and we need to recognise this. So really what it's about is a shift in culture. And this is really what I wanted to emphasise with our staff in the school, is about this change in culture. So it's not asking what's wrong with that child. I think we can all get into the habit of doing that. What is wrong with them? It's more about what's happened with that child and how can we help? What can we do to help this child? So it's really about holding a young person in mind. And as teachers, we always have those students that we do have that connection with, or that we notice and we think, I hope they're okay. So it's holding that person in mind and thinking, what are we actually missing? What are we not actually understanding? So it's to create that space for curiosity and digging deeper and unpick what might be happening. So what we have been doing within our school is we've been using these individual sessions, and a lot of our pastoral team have been using this, and our safeguarding team have been using them. So it's about establishing a rapport and building trust, which is really important, but this does take time. So it's getting to know the child and helping them communicate how they feel is so important. Enabling to feel held in mind. This is those small gestures that help build that rapport, like saying hello to them every day, noticing them down that busy corridor, giving time for the student, leaving that door open so they know that door's open to come and talk to you. Problem-free talking. So children don't always want to talk about what they've been through. So they engage with something that isn't a problem in their life. So what hobbies do they have? What do they enjoy doing outside of school? And it's building that rapport with them. Narrative theory. This starts from the assumption that narrative is a basic human strategy for coming to terms with fundamental elements of our experience, such as time, process, and change. Motivational interviewing is a technique in which you become a helper in the change process. And solution focus is practice concentrates on helping people move towards the future and what they want to learn and what can be done differently by using their existing skills, strategies, and other ideas. Rather than actually focusing on that problem, it's looking towards the future. So connecting with a safe place, as I said before, safe places are not just the buildings, but they can be things that are engaging, that appeal to the young students, such as art, music, history. They help regulate the student. They provide a sense of containment. Students want to feel belonging, so young people feel regulated, and this is a real protective factor. So identify, acknowledge, and build upon strengths. So find out what a child's strengths are. What are they good at? Do they feel confident in this? Support and encourage them. So creating a safe place, how the child can feel safe. So talk about the websites that they can visit, the agencies that are out there that can help and support them. And we all communicate in different ways. So some children prefer face-to-face, some prefer texting, and there may be different ways to talk to get help and support for that child. It's identifying those triggers. So where are those triggers happening and why? Reflect on what is happening. Look at strategies that will allow the child to identify the trigger and put a plan in place of how behaviours can change when this actually occurs. And to instill hope. So there is always hope, and show the child you believe in them and you will support them through this. So what we've done within our school is we've been using different strategies and our staff have been using these. So once you've built that rapport, this is the next stage really of actually supporting that child to regulate those emotions. This particular handout that we use, a problem solving skill, it identifies triggers and we can deconstruct problems and have pause points to reflect on what is happening, to stop and to think and to differentiate those different feelings and put actions with them. We also use the first aid kit. So what we are seeing more in schools, particularly over this COVID period, is an increase in mental health and self-harm. So once the rapport has been built, our pastoral team use different activities to work with our students, to look at strategies and to build resilience in our young people. So it's basically we ask them to write in the box what they feel stressed or upset about and how they can help themselves really. So they might want to use new things, new ideas that come up, strategies, so using apps, things like that, doing mindful colouring, different things like that, and they actually add it to the emotional first aid kit so they can use this and refer to this when they need to. So self-harm, so we discuss this process with the students, how the cycle of self-harm actually works, and we begin the process looking at putting a gap in that cycle and breaking it. This is when the trigger increases and causes distress, that the tension is building and emotions are unregulated. This is where we would use the first aid kit that will help them to put a gap in that cycle. So how would they stop that cycle from happening and what would they use for that? And we also use these, which are really nice. We have a lot of peers that come to us to share their concerns regarding the trauma that their friends have been through or are going through. And we really value this, as some children don't come forward when they're feeling worried or they have concerns, and do share this with their friends. So we support students that share this information with us by working with them as they are worried about their friends, and it is a lot for them to cope with. So we use this safety card with the friends and the students, and they can say who will they all talk to, suggest some websites that they can go on to and how they're going to keep themselves safe. But it's really good for the students to have there with them. So early intervention and resilience, we really need to work with the children to overcome adversity and bounce back from these challenges. It's looking at turning a negative outcome into a positive outcome and building resilience within these children. So this is why it's so important to adopt a trauma-informed practice, understanding and supporting children, building a strong bond with them and looking at what happened with the child and how we can actually help them. So I'm going to share. It's called WARM. So it's a Warwickshire Awakening Resilience model, which I was shown by the virtual school, which I think is absolutely brilliant. And this model looks at a child's life, looking at 5 key factors. So when these factors are present, we're able to move towards resilience. So the first 2 factors, necessity and belonging, are crucial. You can't move up the scale until you establish both of these. So we need to establish that the child's basic needs are being met. Are they sleeping enough? Are they safe? Are they being fed? How much sense of belonging do they have with people? So, do they have a key support person in their life that makes them feel safe? Do they have a friend in school? When this has been established, you can then move to mastery. So, focus on the positive activities, what they're good at, build positivity and belief in them. And independence, this relates to emotional regulation. So how are they with self-control? Are they able to regulate their emotions? And inner self, so do they hold positive views of themselves and their future? So really, just some closing thoughts is what I shared with our staff is relationships are key. Everyone needs a hero in their life, and I believe that any person within our school can be a hero to a child, and we just need to believe in them, and we need to be attachment aware and trauma informed to help children make positive choices. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope it was useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Claire. That was really, really useful. And I think actually what I picked out from that was at the beginning where which for me was a really important message, where you remind us that school is a safe place for our children and young people. And we've seen that more than ever as children have started to return to school after the pandemic, where actually we've started to recognise that for children, school is in some cases that one consistent element of their lives. They know exactly what time they need to be there. They know when they can go to the toilet. They know when they can have their lunch, and they know when they're going home. So we've got a really important role to play in that, to give them and to provide that safe space to them where we can have those really effective conversations and, like you said, form those positive relationships that allow us to provide that kind of early intervention and help them flourish. I just want to pick up on one point you made, Claire, when you was talking, which was the idea of this emotional first aid kit. Now, I think that's a fantastic strategy for helping to develop a really bespoke support pathway for a young child. Just thinking about that, for any school leaders that might be listening and thinking that they want to implement a similar strategy in their own school, what advice would you give them in order to get that set up and for it to be effective in their own schools?
So we've been working really closely with Mind. They've been absolutely fantastic, sharing resources and speaking to us, because we obviously have seen such an increase in self-harm, suicidal thoughts, real trauma, stress going on at home, and they just can't cope. So we wanted to make sure that we could speak to children about it, and the first aid kit allows us to have those conversations. I think sometimes it's really difficult to speak with a child face to face and not have an activity to do, whereas a child will find it easier actually to use that activity, and what we found is it works really well where students tend to open up that little bit more, because they're not only thinking about what strategies they would use themselves, but it's also about opening up to you that little bit more, but not knowing they're actually doing it, so that you are aware of when those bad days are, what will keep them motivated, what will keep them going, stop them from, it's like I say, putting that gap within that cycle to stop them from doing it. And within our school, we celebrate that when they make that change, and that they put a gap in that cycle. We really celebrate that within our school, and I think a lot of our students feel that as well, that we're going through this journey together. So I do feel with the first aid kit, it's something that's really useful within our school. Mind have a PDF, so they have a pack with lots and lots of different resources on. So I'm going to share that with Lewis, and that will be available to you after the podcast has been completed.
Thank you so much, Claire. That's great of you. Thank you. Look, Claire, thank you so much for your time today. I know I'm going to go away and have a look at some of these Mind resources and also some of the NSPCC's resources around childhood adverse experiences and some of their approaches that they've developed around developing this sort of culture and strategy of trauma-informed practice. Do you have any final message? What's your final closing thought? If you could give one key message to a school leader that's listening to this podcast now to close things up, what would you say to them?
I think it's so important to work together. I think we are going through this journey, we're going through this pandemic together. And we need to support each other. We need to listen to the children, we need to listen to each other, and we need to think of ways that we can support and help them and really take on this trauma informed practice as professionals all together.
Claire, thank you so much for your time. And I must say, I'm really grateful to Claire Harwood for giving up her time to speak to us on this episode of Safeguarding Days about trauma-informed practice. Of course, as Claire referenced in her podcast there's some fantastic resources out there which can support you as a school leader in developing that approach of what's wrong to what's happened. Thank you again for listening to this episode. Episode 15 is one I'm really excited for. We're going to be joined by the amazing Dr. Carleen Furman from the University of Bedfordshire, who's going to be talking to us about her and her team's work to develop the contextual safeguarding framework that we know so much about today. She's going to talk to us a little bit about her new book, all about contextual safeguarding, give us some practical tips about what we can do in schools to really embed that strategy of exploring not just what has happened to that young person, but exploring the context in which that harm has occurred. Thank you for listening. You can catch the rest of our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, on YouTube, and on www.safeguardingdays.co.uk.